Hey guys, how you doing? I hope you're doing well. So, this past Friday, Captain America Brave New World released in theaters to mixed responses by both critics and fans. And this video will not be a criticism or review of it. However, what it will be is a look at, the alternative or what could have been, right? Because obviously this is the latest installment in the Captain America trilogy and heavily based on Captain America the Winter Soldier, which many fans, including myself, consider one of the best, if not the best Marvel film of all time. And then, when I started thinking about that in the Winter Soldier, I actually rewatched most of it the other day, and it really got me thinking about how great Chris Evans was as Captain America. And that's not saying Anthony Mackie can't be great. I'm sure he can with the right script. But specifically how they treated Steve Rogers and just made him, in my opinion, one of the best characters in the entire MCU, if not one of the best superheroes. So what I'm going to be doing in this film is breaking into, if I could create one more Marvel project with Steve Rogers, what would it be? And that would be Captain America, Man Out of Time, how Steve Rogers returns the Infinity Stones. Let's get into it. So I believe it's announced that Chris Evans is returning to reprise his role as Captain America, and Avengers Doomsday is set to come out, I believe, in 2026 or 27. And it just got me thinking about how I really don't want them to tarnish this character in his story arc from Avengers Endgame or really any of the previous films, because I felt like it had a really good conclusion, his ending with Peggy, and just overall it had a good finality to it. And I don't want them to ruin that. So it got me thinking about how I would handle this character in a way that would not diminish his ending or anything in the previous films, while just really fleshing out, some key moments or conversations that he could have. So this would be my story of how Captain America returned the 6 Infinity Stones and add a little bit more conclusion to his life. But first, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel if you've already subscribed. Thank you so much. We really appreciate any engagement. We're just a small channel, a couple of friends who love movies, superheroes, sports, MMA, whatever it is. And we appreciate any feedback as well as ideas for future videos. What would you guys like to see? Again, we try to respond to all the comments, and being a small-time channel, we can take your opinions and try to create them into videos or respond to your feedback. Thanks again. A big inspiration for this video, so I got to give credit, is The 5 People You Meet in Heaven by Mitch Albom. I believe I'm saying that right. I just read it. It's fantastic. It's about a man who's about to die and the 5 people who impacted his life or who he impacted the most. And I think it's a really fitting format for Captain America, someone who had so many great dynamics and relationships with people throughout the MCU. So this is going to be a little bit more character-driven than action and adventure. This would be a Disney Plus miniseries, obviously broken into 6 separate episodes with the goal not only to return the Infinity Stones, but provide some resolution to maybe some internal conflict of Captain America's or some relationship that he had difficulty with. Like, for example, Red Skull, obviously one of his first enemies. What would that look like, him resolving that? And then by the end of it, I can't change anything. I have to keep the ending of him staying with Peggy at the end of Endgame. This is just the filler of what happens in between the him leaving in the time machine and him returning. The Return of the Power Stone. I'm choosing this for the first mission or episode as it's a little more lighthearted and comedy-driven, whereas the future episodes will be more focused on character development and, take itself a little more seriously. We open with Captain America standing on the time machine. He says goodbye to Falcon and Bucky as he transports back in time using the Pym particles with the mission to return the Infinity Stones to where they found them originally. We see Cap travel back through time. I think this would be a great way to showcase him in an uncomfortable situation as he arrives on Morag. Unsure of what to do with the mission to return the Power Stone, he arrives just in time to run into Peter Quill. Now, I think this would be interesting to see Cap and Peter interact because we never really got to see that in Infinity War, and I think it could be a fun conversation. The two of them get into some bickering and bantering, a 2 to 3 minute conversation right as Ronan's men arrive. They point guns at the two of them. One of them shoots at Star-Lord, electrocuting him and knocking him out as Cap rolls his eyes. He has beaten Thanos' armies at this point, and to him, these men are nothing more than a bunch of nameless soldiers, which, let's face it, that's what they are. I think this would be a perfect time to showcase Cap's abilities, not only as a super soldier, but he's wielding Thor's hammer as well as has possession of the Infinity Stones. As I said, I think this episode would mostly just be used to have some fun with it and just showcase what Cap could do with all these tools at his disposal. Kind of like in a video game when you go back with all the, weapons and extra powers to face one of the earlier villains. It just shows how overpowered he is, and just have a lot of fun with him tearing through Ronan's men with ease, only to have Star-Lord wake up after the battle, look around, and him think to himself that he was the one that actually took down all those men. I think this could be a lot of fun and just have a good big last battle sequence. Okay, so episode 2 is going to be the return of the Reality Stone, where we see Steve. He used the Space Stone at the end of the last episode to teleport from Morag to Asgard, where he arrives to give the Reality Stone back to Thor. Steve arrives in Asgard. As he's approached by Asgardian soldiers pointing spears at him, there's a brief action sequence as the hammer that Steve is holding in his hand flies out and right into the arms of Thor, who stands before him with the big dramatic cameo being Chris Hemsworth is in this episode as Thor. I really like the relationship between Captain America and Thor throughout the MCU, and I think it would be fun to have a short episode to explore it a little more. You could have Thor invite Steve for dinner that night as he recognizes him. Thor believes that this is a Steve from 2014, or the original Thor the Dark World timeline, in which case this would be happening in. We get a brief moment with Steve as he enjoys a dinner with Thor and the rest of the Asgardian soldiers as they compare war stories. I think this would be a lot of fun to see Steve surrounded by soldiers, even of like a different realm, and he has flashbacks to his days with the Howling Commandos. Steve is most comfortable around the soldiers and service members around him, no matter what world he's on. Just as Steve begins to relax, the Reality Stone explodes, erupting a red smoke throughout the hallway. As Steve is taken into a trance, his reality is shifted as he sees the World War II era banquet hall and him standing in the middle of it. Peggy is standing there before him in the middle as she asks him to have that one last dance. We're reminded that that's all Steve ever wanted, the reality he craved and reality he deserved. This would, of course, be based on the Age of Ultron scene, but I would expand into a little more, maybe showing the future Steve could have, him being a father, having kids, or anything that could just give more depth to what he wanted out of life. Just as Steve wants to stay in this reality, stay there forever, he grabs the Reality Stone in his hands and closes his fist, stopping the trance. As the entire banquet hall goes back to normal and Thor confronts Steve, Steve apologizes, gives him the Reality Stone, and says he needs to go on his way. Thor is confused, thinking this is the 2014 Steve, who vanishes in a moment. As Thor stands there, feeling sorry for his friend, as he sees how sad Steve is. The third episode is going to be based on the returning of the Soul Stone, where we see Steve open a portal onto the planet of Vormir using the Space Stone, that's how he's been traveling around, as he looks up at the ominous mountain and begins to walk up it. Of course, the audience knows that Red Skull is awaiting him, but Steve does not. As he walks up the mountain, I would use this as an opportunity to showcase some of his memories from the blip in that 5-year sequence in between Infinity War and Endgame. What did Steve do? Maybe we see a flashback, as the whole point of this episode is going to be exploring the loss of those in Steve's life and how he deals with the acceptance of that. As Steve walks up the side of the mountain, we see memories of the blip, only for him to arrive at the top and to be stunned to see the Red Skull floating there ominously. Steve pulls out his shield, but soon realizes that the Red Skull has no intention of fighting him. In fact, he's not angry at all. He's not even resentful. He's thankful to Steve for showing him the error of his ways and putting him in a position to be guardian of the stone, where he's not happy necessarily about it, but he knows that it was the consequences of his own actions to be where he is now. The once two mortal enemies now return the Soul Stone as the light bursts into the sky. The Red Skull is grateful for Steve for returning the Soul Stone and grants him one wish, even though Steve didn't ask for it. As Steve covers his eyes from the light, he regains his vision and turns around to see Natasha Romanoff, Black Widow, standing before him. Steve smiles, runs, and gives her a hug. The two of them smile at each other as they rejoin, and Steve gets closure for the last time, getting to say goodbye to one of his best friends. I really love just a conversation between the two of them. Natasha tells him how Tony's happy up in heaven, maybe talking his mouth off. They have good friendly banter, and at the end of it, she just says that she hopes more than anything that Steve finds his happiness and gets to live the life he always wanted. I would just like to give Steve and Natasha one more opportunity, I guess, to get closure, as obviously she was one of his best friends and best teammates. Fourth episode, we will be returning the Space Stone back to Camp Lehigh, as Steve arrives at Camp Lehigh using the Space Stone's portal for the last time. Continuing with the theme for each episode, this one will be going over Steve's connection with the military and Bucky Barnes in particular. The episode opens with Steve arriving in the basement of Camp Lehigh, where he returns the Space Stone. All seems too good to be true when he also realizes he needs to return the Pym particles that they stole in the middle of Avengers Endgame. While Steve is returning the Space Stone, we could have him sneaking around the military compound, trying to do his best to avoid being caught while he returns the Pym particles. Of course, you could have a scene similar to Endgame where he sees Peggy and Howard Stark, specifically Peggy, him realizing how much he would have loved a life with her as he sees her older in age and how beautiful she still is to him. Steve so desperately wants to stop his mission and then tell Peggy he's alive so that way the two of them could have the life he always wanted. But he knows he won't do that. He's not selfish enough, as he needs to return the stones and finish his mission to protect the future. As Steve concludes with returning the Space Stone and the Pym particles, we see him go outside Camp Lehigh, where he sees a group of soldiers running, PTing in the morning. As Steve does this, he takes a seat on a park bench, unaware of the man sitting next to him. That man is revealed to be the retired Colonel Phillips from the original Captain America, the First Avenger, played by Tommy Lee Jones. General Phillips says under his breath, recognizing Steve, "Wow, that Howard Stark really made it work, huh? Or was it Dr. Pym?" referring to one of their test experiments. As Steve gasps, he panics and believes to think that he's done something to ruin the future. As the general consoles him and says, "Don't worry, I won't tell anyone. I'm sure whatever you're doing is important, Cap. After all, everything you did for us, I think I owe you one." The two men reconnect. I think this would be a really nice point just to show someone who was there at the creation of Captain America and knew Steve before the serum, and knew what a good guy he was. The general is grateful as the two compare war stories, and the general talks about how the hardest thing for him was taking off the uniform, something Steve can relate to. As in Captain America Winter Soldier, we saw his question to the military and the army as overall be questioned. Again, I think this would be a great metaphor for Steve leaving that 1940s era of his life behind, and specifically his military service, as it's so hard for veterans nowadays to take off the uniform and reconnect with the world. Just as their conversation concludes, Steve gets up, and the general says to him, "You know, they're planning on naming this place after you, right? I'm in charge of the committee." Steve smirks as he begins to walk away and says, "I think Camp Barnes would be a lot better." As Steve displays that while he can't save Bucky, as it would disrupt the space-time continuum, he wants to honor the sacrifice Bucky Barnes made, and specifically just demonstrate another way in that Steve selflessly puts his friends before himself. As Cap's walking away, it's revealed that since he returned the Space Stone, he needs to get to where he needs to go next on foot. However, he's clutching the Time Stone. He holds it, squeezing it in his hand as the world around him begins to shift. We see it change from the 1970s to 2012. As Steve walks out of the army base, he turns around to see it named Camp Barnes. Steve smiles as he turns from Camp Barnes, located in New Jersey, to New York City across the bay. He sees the space light beam from the events of the original Avengers 2012 film to indicate that he's going back to the events of the original Avengers film. He heads over there with the two remaining Infinity Stones and his shield to finish his mission. The second to last episode is going to be all about Captain America returning the Mind Stone after the events of the Chitauri invasion from the first Avengers film. And I would love to give him one more moment with Robert Downey Jr.'s Tony Stark, only because he never really got to say goodbye to Tony at the end of Endgame and let them have a conversation. With Robert Downey Jr. thinking the whole time that this is the 2012 naive and kind of gullible Captain America, I think he could have a lot of fun with that, while Chris Evans is being earnest and teary-eyed, saying goodbye to who he believes is an old friend, but Robert Downey Jr. making quips and sarcastic comments just because he's asking why Cap is getting so emotional. The two hug as Cap says his goodbyes and says that he'll always be one of his best friends as Cap leaves to return the final Infinity Stone. I would want the majority of this episode to just be the interaction between Cap and Tony. Again, I just think that's such a good relationship. The foundation of the MCU was the two of them and their dynamic, and having one last moment for them to say goodbye to each other in a sense, I think would be really satisfying. All right, the final episode. We see Cap heading to the residence of the Ancient One. It's in New York City, just a couple blocks away from the Avengers Towers, which was stated in Endgame, so he goes by foot. As he enters, the Ancient One, played by Tilda Swinton, encounters him and questions why he's there as he holds up the Time Stone to return it. The Ancient One and Cap have a brief conversation where she thanks Cap for not only returning the Time Stone, but for saving the universe from Thanos. She offers to give him a gift in return. She strikes Steve in the chest as the soul version of himself shoots out of his physical body. Steve is stunned, and so is the audience, as it's revealed that the soul version of Captain America is the short, scrawny, asthma-stricken Steve Rogers, displaying not only to himself but the audience that at the end of the day, he's always just been a small kid from Brooklyn who's wanted to do the right thing. I think, again, this just goes to show that through everything he's been through in all these films, that he hasn't changed while also having an amazing character arc and evolving in this complex world. As Captain America looks down at Steve Rogers, the smaller Steve looks up and says, "Did we win? Did we beat the Nazis?" Captain America nods, proud of what he's done. Steve asks, "Did we do the right thing?" Captain America nods again. Steve, with his voice cracking, asks, "What about Peggy?" As Captain America holds back tears in his eyes and gives the younger version of himself a hug. The two merge back into one as the soul is absorbed back into the body. I think this would just be an amazing opportunity to just display not only how the character's grown, both physically and like how far they've come, but for the audience too, because most of us started this journey. I mean, for me personally, I was like 9 years old, and I think a lot of us are now into our 20s. And just goes to show how we've grown along with these characters, and an opportunity for not only the characters but us to reflect on where we started and where we are, as with Steve Rogers. I just think this could be a really touching moment. I just think it'd be great. So to finish it out, Captain America turns to the Ancient One. She sees what he wants more than anything in life, as she holds the Time Stone and uses it to begin spinning the universe back into time, as Steve tries to stop her, knowing he's going to mess up the space-time continuum. Before he can, the universe shifts around him as time travels back to 1945 at the end of World War II, where there's parades in the streets as Steve looks down and sees the Americans celebrating the defeat of the Nazis. The final episode concludes with Steve running to Peggy. He remembers her apartment from the original film. As he runs to her, she's the only one not celebrating the end of the war. She's sitting in her apartment crying. As he stands at her doorway, she gasps, unable to believe he's real. But the two embrace and hug. The remaining of the last episode, I would have like a montage similar to that of the movie Up, where we see the life Steve and Peggy have together. The one that I just think would be so satisfying to see Steve have the life he's always deserved, but never been selfish enough to take. The character arc was that Iron Man had to learn to become selfless, and Steve had to learn to become selfish, with the two of them crossing paths and learning from each other. And I would just love to see just a short, montage with maybe some music of Steve and Peggy, their wedding, Peggy becoming pregnant, them buying their first house together, Steve raising kids, teaching them how to ride a bike, throw a baseball. As they grow old, Steve begins to get gray hair. As Peggy does, the kids move out of the house, and then as Peggy dies, we see Steve as an old man walking to the park where he knows that Bucky and Sam will be waiting for him all those years later, getting to live the life he always deserved, ready to hand off the shield to Falcon and say goodbye to his friends forever. Again, I just think that this would be a great way to end the character. We're not changing anything from Endgame, but giving him a satisfying conclusion and showing a little bit of that life that he deserved to have, more than almost any other character in the MCU. Thank you so much for listening. If you got this far, I really appreciate it. Please drop a comment in the comments and let me know what you liked, what you didn't like, what you changed. What videos do you want to see from us in the future? There's a lot of cool stuff coming up. We want to hear your feedback. Thanks again. I hope you have a great day. See you next time.